occasions. But the reason I say that is because it was clear that in Mr Cummings, the Prime Minister had picked someone that he had decided to, for whatever reason, to trust with a huge amount of responsibility and power. And many times I felt like that many of the key decisions were being made by Mr Cummings and not the Prime Minister, in a way that I had not seen with any other Prime Minister, certainly that I had worked with. And what was different for me, in some respect, is that because I was the Chancellor and therefore obviously oversaw the Treasury in its operations, it meant that it was much harder to exclude the Treasury from any key decisions, because even if those decisions are not directly related to the Treasury's functions, any department, especially if it required resources or even any kind of regulatory change, it would concern the Treasury. And the Treasury, I think, is probably the only department other than the Prime Minister's office, if we see that as a department, that has to sign off on virtually any sort of policy initiative or any policy change in government, in what's called, there's a process that's often referred to as the right round process. And the Treasury will be the one department that other than obviously the lead department, that would get quite involved in most decisions. So my point being that it was hard to exclude the Treasury, and then what that meant in the context of your question, Ms Cecil, was that if there were situations where, in particular, if Mr Cummings wanted something to happen or had a particular view on a policy or initiative, I would know about it, my team would know about it, and if I had an issue with that or wanted to question it or had a different opinion, it was hard to exclude, but also many times I could block it and stop it from happening, or at least delay it until I see the Prime Minister, which was not always possible by other cabinet ministers.
And indeed, we will come to seeing references to power struggles between number 10 and number 11, the Treasury, during the pandemic in due course, not in relation to your time, but later in the period. But in terms of your role as Chancellor, effectively you had oversight across government, for each government department, but also significantly number 10, and any policies or processes emanating from there that required financial resource or input, or indeed regulatory consideration. We've heard some evidence in relation to Gavin Williamson and he says that he was excluded from decision making. Is that something that you would have expected, bearing in mind how you've described the centralisation of power?
I wouldn't know the details of any particular sort of occasion that he might be referring to, but it is something as a sort of part of the decision-making process at the time that I would recognise, yes.
In terms of decision-making, if I can just call up paragraph 49, please, page 16 of your statement. And you've touched upon this already in dealing with who was making those decisions in terms of how you viewed it at the time. Approximately a third of the way through. It refers to Mr Cummings, who was in post at the time. You say, I'd say that during my time as Chancellor, I considered he sought to act as a Prime Minister in all but name, and he tried to make all key decisions within number 10, not the Prime Minister. Now, why do you say that?
Because that's how things seem to be working at the time. So, for example, my private office, that's my group of civil servants that are directly serving me as Chancellor on a daily basis. Quite often, it's not unusual, first of all, to get a request from the Prime Minister's office, from number 10. It's not unusual at all, of course. But a lot of those requests, once probed, weren't actually coming from the Prime Minister. There might be anything from a request for information, request for detail, but also for policy change or policy preference. On probing further, they would be coming from Mr Cummings. And if it was one or two times, just a few times, then that I wouldn't have thought anything sort of unusual of that. But it was constantly, it seemed so many requests of that nature were coming from Mr Cummings. And on many occasions, when I would then eventually meet the Prime Minister and talk with him, and and it's worth just, this is relevant to one of your previous questions, is that because I was Chancellor, because I was literally living in the same building as the Prime Minister, I would not just see him on formal occasions, but also informally as well, might be at the weekend in the Number 10 garden or somewhere, when I can say, look, I heard that you wanted this or you wanted that. And he would sometimes just not even know that that request had come in his name. And this could be, for example, I was working early from January to February in those 2 particular months. I was working on the budget, which was to come very soon in the new year. And obviously, a budget is an opportunity to make a significant number of policy changes for the government. And I was getting a lot of requests relating to the budget, which on probing were coming directly from Mr Cummings and not the Prime Minister. And it's not something I would have expected. And just to add a little bit more to that, if I may, although that was the first time I'd served as Chancellor, I had been in the Treasury as both the Economic Secretary and the Financial Secretary under George Osborne when he was Chancellor. So I had a bit of a sense about how I would have expected things to work, and this was very unusual.
An unusual structurally in terms of decision-making and communications.
Yes.
This paragraph also, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail, deals with your resignation. The facts are already in the public domain, and you've spoken on a number of occasions about that.
Yes.
But in terms of the evidence that this inquiry has heard in relation to the dysfunctional nature, it's been all sorts of different words have been used, as I'm sure you're aware: toxic, dysfunctional, those types of things, feral. With regard to that, were you aware of that at the time in January and February? That culture was existing within Number 10, or was that something that you were not cited on?
Yes, broadly, I think it was a widespread feeling amongst a lot of the political advisors working in Number 10, many ministers. The Number 10 operation collectively was quite dysfunctional. I think many ministers had noticed. We've just referred to a moment ago about who was really seemed to be making a lot of the decisions, and you refer to my resignation, and as you say, I've talked about that publicly in Parliament and elsewhere, and unless you want to probe further, I won't go into it. But one thing I will is, if I think back to my resignation day as Chancellor in 13th of February 2020. That on that day, the Prime Minister had just to demonstrate how widespread the feeling around Mr Cummings was within Number 10 at the time. On that day, when the Prime Minister said he wanted to keep me as Chancellor, but wanted me to replace all my advisors, which I refused to do, he asked me to take some time out. He said, "Look, just take 10, 15 minutes. You go to a separate room, I'll go to my study, and let's just, you go and think about this and let's talk again. I don't want you to resign." When I went into that room, I thought I'd sort of be on my own for 10, 15 minutes and just think about it. Obviously, it was a big decision to resign as Chancellor. But while I was in that room, I remember distinctly first Helen McNamara coming in, and then Eddie Lister was one of the Prime Minister's senior advisors. Miss McNamara, I think you know who she is from previous evidence. And they both came in to say the same thing, which was the Prime Minister is only doing this because of Dominic Cummings. He's asked him to do this, and the Prime Minister doesn't really know what he's doing in asking you to do this, and this is all Dominic Cummings. Don't fall for it. Sajid was their message, that Dominic Cummings will be gone within a few weeks. There's no way he can survive the way he's going on. They both essentially, I'm summarising.
Encouraged you to stay.
Yeah, encouraged me to stay because they knew that the problem within Number 10, as they saw it, was Dominic Cummings, and that their view was that Dominic Cummings can't survive in Number 10 in carrying on the way he is, and he will be gone very soon.
If I can just interrupt you there, just to bring you back really to the structural issues that faced that office at the time. To what extent was that dysfunctionality, as you see it, within the Cabinet Office related to that centralisation or power, or was it something that you'd also seen previously under other cabinets?
I think Mr Javid said the dysfunctionality that he saw was in Number 10.
I'm terribly sorry, not Cabinet, in Number 10. My apologies, my lady, you're entirely correct.
That's right.
In Number 10.
To what extent was your question? Sorry, could you repeat, please?
Yes, I was just going to ask, to what extent did you consider that to be related specifically to that number 10 environment as opposed to other administrations that you'd served under? Was it different? Or was it very similar to how governments operate generally in number 10?
It was different in my experience, and obviously I can't speak to other governments. Certainly in my experience, I think the extent of dysfunctionality was something I had not experienced before in any government.
Now, if I may turn just to the machinery of government in relation to cross-departmental working, cross-government working.
So I'm sorry to interrupt again, Ms. Hessel. SPADs special advisors obviously have a very important role, and I've been told that they are technically civil servants, but don't in reality answer to the Permanent Secretary, they answer to their minister.
That's correct.
You've obviously had them. Is there anything in the setup or the structure of the role of special advisors that you think might improve the position? You felt that one special advisor had gained prominence, too much prominence, and too much decision-making power and responsibility. Is there anything you can think of in the structural arrangements that might help alleviate that situation without impinging on the discretion of a Prime Minister to appoint the special advisors he wants?
I think, my lady, it's hard to think of something that would make a difference that wouldn't impinge on the discretion of the Prime Minister or the Minister. Technically, I believe that all special advisors are appointed by the Prime Minister of the day. The Prime Minister can appoint them and also dismiss them, but they normally the relevant minister would have a say in who they would like to be their special advisor or not. But because special advisors are the only members of a minister's team that can be political, and I think a minister does need people that are able to be political, I think it becomes then very hard if there was, for example, I have heard people talking about maybe there should be some kind of vetting process or panel for interviews and things like you would have with civil servants. But I don't see how that could work with special advisors. I think a lot at the end of the day just comes down to the choices that a Prime Minister and Minister makes.
Personalities.
Personalities, yes.
Someone did suggest making special advisors accountable in the line of responsibility to the Permanent Secretary.
I haven't thought about that too much, but my initial reaction would be that it would probably make the political side of their work harder, given a Permanent Secretary cannot be or should not be political in any way.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Mr.
No, not at all, and perhaps just rounding that one off. What about merit-based open recruitment based on competencies for those special advisors? Is that something you could see working?
Again, Ms. Cecil, I'm not sure how that would work. There is. First of all, I think in the process, if it's done properly, there is a merit part to it. In that, I think most ministers would clearly want to pick people to be their special advisors that they believe are up to their job and can carry out the role. But it is, if what you're getting at is that it's not a process where there's as I say, like a panel or some kind of objective process that's gone through, then I think introducing that into the process would take something away as well, which does have value at times, and that is the ability for ministers to consider things from a political perspective, which at the end of the day, all ministers are also politicians, and they would need to have advice on that. So, for example, when a minister, if I give you one quick example, in all my ministerial roles, I appeared in front of media, at least once a week. Sometimes when I was health secretary, I'd be doing 5 or 6 days a week. And obviously the media can ask you any question you want, and some of those are deliberately political, and you need to be well prepared for that, and only special advisors can prepare you for that.